So, Ezekiel 29 is where we're at. We're going to go from chapter 29 to chapter 32. And this is the seventh oracle given by Ezekiel. It's to Egypt, and it has 7 parts. So, if you're running through this on your daily Bible reading, you're going to go through it and you're going to think, man, this is dry stuff. It's interesting maybe, but you're going to go through and everything's going to kind of run together. And generally, just in daily Bible reading, going through it in chronological order, it looks kind of strange. But tonight, the way we're going through it, I think you're going to enjoy it quite a bit more because while it looks on one end, here, let me give you these. While it looks on one end like a bunch of distorted, you need some too? Well, all right. Well, there you go. I am out of them now. There may be some others hanging out. Oh, there's some back there in a chair. Okay. So we're in chapter 29. What we're going to find tonight, looking at 29, 30, 31, and 32, I think, do I have some more back there, Doug? Good. Okay, thank you for passing that out. Thank you. What you're going to find out as you go through is we're actually covering some pretty decent stuff that's interesting because it explains what else you're going to find in the Bible. For example, 29 and 32, we meet a dragon who lives in the Nile, and he looks like a crocodile, and he smells like a crocodile, and he acts like a crocodile, and we call this little critter, this little crocodile, a Leviathan and a dragon. And that really helps you when you're trying to make sense of Job 41. What is Leviathan? According to this passage, we're looking at the crocodile, which is located in Egypt. Also, as you keep going through here, you're going to see in chapter 30, late 30, early 31, what's called the Eden motive. Now, of course, that's a strange word there. But if you haven't heard it here, but if you listen to a lot of preachers, they have a theory, doctrine, I don't know if you'd even call it a doctrine, called New Heavens, New Earth. And it comes from a fellow who's an Episcopalian or Anglican over in England. And it's a doctrine that when the second coming happens, we're not going to get called up into heaven, but instead, earth is going to be transformed into heaven, and we're going to live in the Garden of Eden, and Jesus is going to come back to Jerusalem. And we're not going to chase that rabbit that far because I really don't know a lot of us here who've heard that or even got caught up with that, especially in this class, probably the younger classes, the younger adult classes. A few more people have run across that. But a lot of that comes from or is explained when we're running through this Eden motive as we're looking at Egypt here. So actually 29, 30, 31, and 32 shed a ton of light on the rest of Scripture. Because remember, John, the Apostle John, loves Ezekiel. And maybe you remember in our introduction, which felt like 5 years ago, it wasn't, it was just a few months ago. Maybe you remember we went to the introduction, John quotes Ezekiel like crazy. And so you're going to see it all through the Gospel of John. You know, you got the Good Shepherd there in John 10. We're going to see that once we get to chapter 33 and 34. You've got the living water, which you have coming out of Ezekiel. John, the Gospel of John, loves to quote, and he brings those quotes right into Revelation. And so you'll see like the last 2 chapters are a retelling of chapters 40 through 48 of Ezekiel. So when you figure out Ezekiel, it's kind of a building block to help you understand the rest of the Bible. But guess what we never cover in church? Ezekiel, because we read it and we're like, man, this dude is crazy. You know, what in the world has he got going on? So if you recall, we just did the destruction of Jerusalem. Ezekiel's wife dies. He takes a break. This is the very middle of the book. And he starts looking around at the 7 nations who are celebrating at the destruction of Jerusalem. And then we'll get to chapter 33 and see that Jerusalem has fully fallen. So he goes around and he points out each nation and their sin that they've had in talking about Jerusalem falling and celebrating about it. And so he goes about to each one of those, and he spends a lot of time on the city of Tyre, Tyre, and then he spends a ton of time on Egypt, and that's what we're going to look at. In fact, his seventh oracle actually comes in 7 parts, so it's 7 oracles of the seventh oracle. Maybe you've seen that in the book of Revelation as you look at the seals, but that's what's coming along here, and that's what you're going to see. So there's the nerdy stuff if you're reading your notes, because of the 11 dates, 6 of them are found right through here. The second one comes a lot later. The rest of them come right after the destruction of Jerusalem. But before each oracle, he gives a date, except for the third one, as you go through. And so you'll see that as we go. All right. So looking at context, not chasing our rabbits through new heaven, new earth, not chasing our rabbits through a Leviathan and all that business. Why does this matter to somebody 2,000 years later? Why is it we're spending time studying this? Well, you look at the geopolitical system going on here. Politics, and you know how our country right now is wrapped up in politics. You've got 2 superpowers. Remember in the Cold War, it used to be us and Russia. Later, it seemed to be us and China, perhaps. You've got the 2 superpowers going back and forth. Every nation that's smaller, say in Africa, Central America, South America, they look at the 2 superpowers and they try to decide, who do we follow? Who is it that we're going to follow? Who will give us the most? Who will protect us in the best way? And all these sort of things. 10 years ago, I remember going on a mission trip down to Dominica. That's the West Indies or the Caribbean, going down close to Honduras on the southern part of the West Indies. And as I was there, the people there speak French, but there is a brand new soccer stadium. They call it a football stadium. And that stadium holds more people than live on that island. All the roads on Dominica are freshly paved, and much of the infrastructure looks really good. Their electricity, sewer, water, all those things, everything's underground. When a hurricane comes, it's not a problem at all to them. It's interesting because that's different than it is everywhere else. Well, where did all that money come from? Every once in a while, you'll see somebody in the military uniform of China, a Chinese army, walking the streets. There's a lot of Chinese people there. And that city or that island of Dominica has chosen over the past 20 years to attach itself to China. And so China is loaning them a large amount of money to do certain things. Now, what did they expect in return? Nobody in Dominica at that time knew. They were just glad somebody showed up and built a football stadium. You see that happening in smaller countries in Africa. You see that happening in South America. People are choosing their superpower, and their superpower takes care of them. That's exactly what's happening here. There is Babylon, which is on the north side of the world at that time in the Fertile Crescent. And then on the bottom, you have Egypt. And through the centuries, it's waxed and waned over who's more powerful and what's going on as you look through this. And so we're looking at the Egyptian Pharaoh, and we'll meet him a little bit more later. He has just come to the throne about 589. This is about 2 years before the fall of Jerusalem. Remember, they go backwards in the BC. He has just come to the throne, and he is cranking up to try to come up and take over all the nations around Jerusalem and maybe even come up to fight into Babylon. Now, there's a question, who are we going to pick? Remember Josiah, and this is about 40 years before this time, had decided that Babylon was going to be the one that wins, and so he went out and fought in the battle of Megiddo, which we know in Revelation is Armageddon. He went and fought in the battle of Megiddo, and the Egyptians killed him. During this time, everybody in Jerusalem has decided Egypt. Egypt is better. Egypt is who we love. And that's because the Babylonians have held everybody into captivity. And the thought process is, if we love Egypt and if we support Egypt, then Egypt will free us and we'll get to go home. And so they're trying to help Egypt to ascend and become better. And that's why when you read in 2 Chronicles about some of the kings there, they're sending emissaries down to Egypt to bring them back. And so you read throughout Jeremiah where he talks about don't go to Egypt. Don't go to Egypt. As a matter of fact, they tie Jeremiah up and drive him to Egypt. I guess they drove, maybe a chariot. In the Bible, they used an accord, right? They all met with one accord. All right. But anyway, that's New Testament, not Old Testament. So they took Jeremiah down to Egypt. He complained, finally was able to come back. Egypt was who everybody trusted in, believed in, and wanted to win. God was not having any of it because he had chosen Babylon. And so since Babylon was his instrument to punish Jerusalem, Babylon was supported by God rather than Egypt. Now, I know a lot of us don't exactly have minor prophets on the tip of our tongue. You've got Jonah maybe and Hosea maybe. You've got a prophet named Habakkuk. Not tobacco, Habakkuk. Depending on how you say it in your accent, sometimes when you're talking about Habakkuk, they think you're talking about smoking. Habakkuk cries out to God in chapter 1, and he says, God, why are you letting the rich punish the poor? There's oppression. And God says, I'm going to take care of the problem. I'm bringing forth the Chaldeans to come and wipe out everybody. And Habakkuk responds in the end of chapter 1, God, you're not allowed to do that because these Babylonians are evil. They're terrible. And so a righteous, holy God could not use a pagan guy like Nebuchadnezzar. And so God, you don't understand how God works, God. That kind of sounds funny, doesn't it? And so chapter 2 opens up, and Habakkuk is told by God, you write what I'm about to say on a big signpost, and you run all around and show everybody, because this is what they need to know. And what is it? Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4, the righteous man shall live by his faith. All right? That term needs to ring true to you, because when you read in Hebrews 10, we see that the basis of the book of Hebrews is that statement, the righteous live by faith, right? When you read in Galatians 3, Galatians works off on the fulcrum of the righteous man shall live by faith. Romans chapter 1 and verse 17, as Paul is introducing what it means to be righteous in the sight of God, what's he say in 1:17? Just as it is written, the righteous man shall live by his faith. What's that story mean? It means you and I don't always understand what God's doing, but we do know that God is doing. So you be faithful to God, you follow God instead of coming up with all your plans, and God will take care of you on the other side. Israel didn't like this. They didn't like having their nation destroyed, even though they deserved it and brought it on themselves. And so in their last few days, right before the destruction, they are grasping at straws, begging Egypt to come. And Hophras, the Pharaoh, actually does come up outside of Jerusalem, and the Chaldean army moves out of the way, and the siege is broken. But the Pharaoh gets scared, and he goes back home, and he's eventually destroyed and murdered by his own people. And the Chaldeans come back, and they destroy Jerusalem. So, what is the context that we're going to see here? You got a superpower that everybody is trusting in. What God is saying is, trust in God, not in people. All right? Is Donald Trump going to save the world? No. Is Joe Biden going to save the world? No. You vote for who you vote for because you're citizens of our country, Romans 13. But God is using these people, even if we totally disagree with what they stand for and who they are, God using them for his purpose. And we may be on their side, and we may not be on their side. God is still using them for his purpose. I knew a guy in college, this shows you how old I am. The entire administration of Bill Clinton, he wore something black every single day. He was so Republican that he decided just for those 4 years, and poor fella, it turned into 8 years, he would wear something black every single day. So it was shoes, it was pants, it was a shirt, it was a hat, because he thought the world was falling apart because a wrong guy was president, okay? Do you think people were mourning when the Republicans took over? There's probably somebody, I don't know if they wore black, but there's somebody upset. When you allow yourself to become overwhelmed with the plans of men and the thoughts of men, and you forget that really God is the one in charge, you open yourself up to a ton of stress and a ton of problems. Okay, all right. We actually got to start reading the Bible here. Go to chapter 29, okay? Verse 2, Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh and tell him this in verse 3, I'm against you, you monster who lies in the midst of your rivers. You have said the river is my own. I have made it for myself. You go down to Memphis, that's in Egypt. Not Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, Egypt. You see this Pharaoh's temple, which is full of columns, and it's right by the side of the Nile. And guess what he's inscribed on many of those columns? Here is the Nile. I am the God who has made it. So this is a quote directly from this guy. All right, God says, you said you made it for yourself. He said, look what I'm going to do. Verse 4, I'm going to put hooks in your jaws and cause a fish of your rivers to stick to your scales. I'm going to bring you out of the mist, and all the fish of the rivers will stick to your scales. I'm going to leave you in the wilderness, you and all the fish of the rivers, and they shall fall in the open field. And you shall not be picked up or gathered. I've given you as food to the beasts of the field and to the birds of the heavens. All right, all you folks who love to fish, when you catch a carp, now I know some folks catch carp and make a lot of money because they sell it, by the pound. But generally, if you're out there catching carp, you catch a carp, what do you do with it? All right, well, you don't want to eat it unless you're really desperate or you've watched the wrong YouTube video, all right? And you really don't want to throw it back because it's going to just repopulate and crowd out all the fish that we actually like to eat for our fish fry. And so what people usually do when they catch a trash fish is they just throw it on the shore, throw it up, somewhere where it can't go back, and just let it die. And birds are going to eat it. Animals are going to eat it. All this decay and the gross stuff that happens when you look around. That's what God's saying is about to happen. God says, you're a crocodile. You claim that you own the Nile. You run the Nile. This is all your place. And he says, I'm just going to catch you with my hook, throw you out, and leave you out here. And your flesh is going to rot under the sun. All right. Egyptians don't like this, right? What do Egyptians do to their dead people? Yes, turn them into mummies, all right? And so they don't like this idea of decay, and so that there's a little bit of that coming through here as you go through. And so you see that they're going to be destroyed, and everything is going to go south for them. Okay, now look at verse 6. Egypt is famous for their papyrus that came in those reeds that were next to the Nile River. As a matter of fact, so many people like to write. The papyrus now is extinct. You see there in verse 6, they shall know I'm the Lord. They have been a staff of reed to a house of Israel. They took hold of you with the hand. You broke and tore all their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke and made all their backs quiver. All right. No one within 2 miles of my house raises corn. I'm not sure why, but that's just the way it is. After the tornado, we ended up with corn stalks all over my front and backyard. We got corn stalks, a piece of tin, and a really, really ugly sweater in the top of a tree. And it took me forever to get that ugly sweater down. You take a corn stalk, and it's long, it's straight, and you think, this would make a pretty good walking stick. What happens if you ever use it as a walking stick? It's going to break. Yeah, it's just going to crumble away. Here's the analogy God's trying to bring out here. God says, you're these reeds. You look like you'd be a great walking stick. Everybody thinks Egypt's who they need to tie their flag to. Egypt's who they need to follow. And he said, but the second they take you, you're going to splinter up and you're going to pierce people. If somebody leans on you, it's going to go right through your shoulder like a knife. And so these people who think they're trusting in Egypt, it's not going to work. These people are not what you want them to be or what you think that they're going to be. And so they're going to be destroyed. And this term is used for 40 years, you're going to be gathered, and never again will Egypt be the superpower that it has been in the previous dynasties which have come along. Cleopatra tried to raise it up, but remember Cleopatra was at least half Greek, probably all Greek, and she was not as powerful as the previous ones who were there. All right, so now you go down and look there in verse 18. He says, Nebuchadnezzar looks weak right now because for 18 years, siege of Tyre. He says, man, they have worked so hard, their heads are sunburned, their shoulders are raw from getting to the stone, trying to take this over. And he said, they're not going to be able to take over Tyre the way they want to. And so I'm going to give them a gift for the work in which they've done. And what's that gift going to be? It will be Egypt. And so they're going to plunder the army, and they are going to get everything there that they want to. And so as you look at that, it's pretty interesting to see their labor, looking there in verse 18, their wages is going to be Egypt that comes across. All right, so now the next one. Let's look at chapter 30. And in chapter 30, there's a funeral lament. Back then, remember, they were not able to rhyme words like we do because there's no vowels in Hebrew. And so they weren't able to rhyme. And so they have this cadence which comes across. And so it looks like a poem in our Bibles, and it is a poem. And he comes through and he begins talking through chapter 30 of about how they're going to fall and the ways that'll be. Now, what's interesting about this is Ezekiel knows Egypt. All right, you first moved to Marshall County, like me, okay? I've only been here 10 years. You're not really a Marshall Countyan until the third generation, right? Pretty much. All right. I remember when my mom moved here, I was like, Mom, all you got to do is you got to know where the church building is and where Walmart is. Everything else will fill in eventually. And so, that's what we worked on because that's how I figured out life. Figure out where Walmart is, figure out where the church building is, you will be okay. All right. Now, you talk to somebody who's new and you tell them to meet you over in Olive. Okay? Or where else? Doug, where is it you're from? Brewers. All right. Meet me over in Brewers. Okay? And you type that into your phone and your phone giggles. Right? Because your phone's not from Marshall County. All right. Is it Dexter? That's like over towards Hardin. What are some of the other major metropolises of this area? Huh? Possum Trot? Okay. Dogtown? Absolutely. Okay. So what Ezekiel does is it's like, okay, you don't think I know Egypt? He starts naming every city anywhere around it, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. He says, you got the Cush, that's the Ethiopians over here. You got the Put, those are the people in Libya. And he just names everybody. And more or less what he's doing is just showing off, saying God is so in charge. He knows Egypt better than you know Egypt. And so he's listing off all these places you come across. And bless our hearts, when we go through and try to figure out where some of these places are on our map, we got issues. Like, look in chapter 30, verse 14, okay? Pathros will be desolate, set fire to Zoan, right? Fury in verse 15 on sin. All right, you keep going down. Verse 18, Tephanes, that they shall also be darkened. You don't really find a lot of those places on the map because it's kind of like, we're talking about here, as you go through and see all those things as they happen. All right, let's keep rolling. Chapter 31. Let's go ahead and check this out. Chapter 31, Son of man, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his multitude. Verse 2, who are you like in your greatness? Assyria, and remember Assyria and Egypt had gone to the battle of Megiddo, and they had been in several battles, and they had fought as allies. Assyria was no longer big enough to fight Babylon, and so they went and paid Egypt, and Egypt brought up all their armies. And so they had a horde of people, two nations, and they still lost to the Babylonians. That was, we're talking 31 years before this comes out. So these people remember this pretty well. He starts off, and he says, Assyria is a cedar in Lebanon. Now, of course, he's using an analogy here. We would say the mighty oak tree. Think of the biggest, strongest tree that you've got around. Whatever tree that might be, a hickory or an oak or whatever else. And he says it's a cedar and Lebanon's fine branches, shades the forest, high stature. Its top is thick with the boughs. The waters make it grow. It has underground waters coming to it. Everything is perfect. Verse 5, his height is exalted above the trees of the field. All the birds in the heavens make their nests in the branches that are there. It's beautiful, verse 7, in its greatness. And the cedars in the garden of God could not hide in it. The fir trees were not like its boughs. The chestnut trees were not like its branches. No tree in the garden of God was like it in beauty. And I made it beautiful with a multitude of branches, so that the trees of Eden envied it that were in the garden of God. All right. Here's the picture that you've got going on here. Now, this is where people who are doing New Heavens, New Earth, and New Testament mess up, because they don't see this back here, that when you're talking about the Garden of Eden, you're talking in imagery. When we talk about going to the garden in Revelation and other, there's a lot of imagery going there. Be careful when you get literal in the book of Revelation. But that's another class. All right. In here, what you see is a guy who, let's make it smaller, okay? We'll make it in my world. Here's your garden. All right, you've got a garden, and you planted it. Hopefully you haven't planted it yet, because it's going to freeze again, because it always seems to freeze again. But say you've planted your garden, and you've got beans, and you've got peas, and you've got squash, and you've got cucumbers, and you've got corn. Everything is doing just right, okay? They're all in their rows. This is a time full of hope for gardeners, because weeds have not started yet, right? You know, when you get to July, you have to start hoeing out your garden. I always decide that's enough vegetables, let it go. Because, that gardening thing's hard. Here's the garden, and one of the plants just goes crazy. And it decides it's the greatest plant. I'm the biggest cucumber ever, right? Or I'm the biggest watermelon ever. And so it just takes over the entire garden. It goes beyond this row, begins to crowd out this row and that row and everything else. And it just grows and grows and grows. God says, Assyria was like that in my Garden of Eden. That tree grew up. It attracted everything. It started to take all the water from everybody. It started with its shade to get everybody out. It just took over. So when something destroys your garden that way, guess what you do? You remove it, okay? You take it out so the rest of the garden can do well. You don't want one crazy plant. You want, everybody else to do well. So what God says is, hey, you are the cedar of Lebanon. You are a beautiful tree. But because of your pride, you went beyond everybody, beyond the bounds of God. You took everything over and became the greatest tree around. Now, when the people built the Tower of Babel, the greatest tower ever, what did God do? He changed the language, said, I told you to spread out. Now you have to, because you can't understand one another. And he scattered the people everywhere. Pride, when it comes, God plucks it out and spreads us out. He scatters us to the winds, and that's what happened to Assyria. Assyria met Babylon because Babylon was God's agent. Babylon just pulled it up, threw it away. Assyria is no more. It's done. Now, Nineveh is the capital city of Assyria. No more. Now, the reason God is telling this story is because who is the new weed in town, or the new weed in the garden, to stay in our analogy? It's who we've been talking about. Yeah, you've got Egypt, which is growing, and you've got this Pharaoh, Hophni, who is going, and he's saying he's more powerful and he's stronger than anybody else, and he is just absolutely going to overcome everybody who is around. And so when you got this crazy weed growing, guess what God's about to do again? He's about to pull it up. Egypt's not going to be able to fight against God and redirect God either. And so that's what you're looking at when you read through there in chapter 31. You see that, look in verse 14, No trees by the waters will ever exalt themselves for their height, nor set their tops among the thick boughs, that no tree drinks water may ever be high enough to reach them. They've been delivered to death, to the depths of the earth, and among the children of men who go down into the pit. All right? So that's what you're looking at. Now, let me hit reverse real quick, because there's something I like here. I think it's kind of funny and enjoyable for me, but that kind of shows my nerdiness again. Okay? Go back to verse 20. And when you go back to verse 20, you're going to see the Pharaoh Hophra, H-A-P-H-R-A. And if you Google Hophra, you're going to see that he lost his battle so bad when he was strangled by the mercenaries. And the mercenaries that killed him were Greek, that history today knows him by a Greek name. That's how bad he lost. He even lost his name. He ended up with a Greek name, but Hophras is his name. Hophras, when you go to Memphis and you look at all the pictures of him, and he's actually embalmed down there, when you look at all the pictures of him, he has always got his hand up in the, I guess it would be this arm, always has his hand up in the air with a sword. He's this guy. And so if you're trying to read the lines and trying to check out hieroglyphics, I heard somebody talk about how hieroglyphics, those little letters that the Egyptians used, how they were really high tech, because you look at people today who are sending, the things back and forth on their cell phones. We have gone back to hieroglyphics, haven't we? Smiley faces and whatever else you've got. Well, the way that you identify Hophra is he's always got his hand up. He is always about to kill somebody because he is a warrior king. And so knowing that, let's notice how God talks to Hophra. Okay, verse 21, Son of man, what did God just do? Look here, verse 21 of chapter 30. Okay, Son of man, I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And see, it's not bandaged for healing, nor splint put on to bind it, to make it strong enough to where it could ever again hold a sword. All right? Now, if that doesn't work, look at verse 22. Let's break the other arm. Okay? And so we break both arms, and the sword falls out of his hands. Okay? So now skip down to verse 24. So now the picture of Hophra, instead of having the sword up, is going to be in a sling, and he's not able to really do anything hardly. He's going to have huge, major problems. So in 24, I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put my sword in his hand, but I will break Pharaoh's arms, and he will groan before him with the groans of a mortally wounded man. And so the Egyptians are going to be scattered. God says, okay, the way that you identify yourself is by holding your sword up. I'm just going to take this arm off. I'm going to put my sword in the King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to be holding his sword up, and it's turned backwards on you. So you see how God is using irony, talking about how they're going to be destroyed and how this stuff is going on and all these things happening. All right, now chapter 32. Remember 31, we talked about the Garden of Eden here, or the analogy of the Garden of Eden and the cedar of Lebanon. Now 32, here is the final lamentation, okay? Verse 2, you are like a young lion among the nations. You're like a monster in the seas, bursting forth in your rivers, troubling the waters with your feet and fouling the rivers. All right. Pharaoh calls himself the lion. He's a lion of the Nile. And God is saying, you're a crocodile. And you look at the crocodile. Crocodiles, are pretty fast for a short period of time. But their legs are so short, they really can't go anywhere all that very fast, can they? Now, you don't want to mess with them very much. But he looks at this crocodile, and he says, really all you're doing is just making the water muddy when you think you're powerful and you think you're going to destroy everything. And so, verse 3, God spreads a net with a many company of people, and they draw them up in a net. They leave them on land and cast them in the open fields. They cause them to settle. All the birds are going to come, and all the beasts are going to come, and they're going to eat him and destroy him. All the land, verse 6, will flow with his blood. Verse 7, I'll put out the light, and all these things will end. Now, if we had more time, and if I didn't put you to sleep any more than perhaps I already am, what you're going to do is run through here and you're going to run across a list of the gods of Egypt. When you run across those lights and you run across the different things, you've got Ra and Osiris and everybody coming through. And so God's not only said, I know where all your cities are, he's saying all your gods, I'm kind of making fun of them because I'm about to absolutely destroy every single one of them. And so the sword of Babylon is going to be against them, and they are going to be left and absolutely destroyed. All right. So we finished the oracle in chapter 32, starting in verse 8. We're going to talk about the Assyrians, or 22, verse 22, I'm sorry. We're going to talk about the Assyrians again. These are the allies of Egypt. 24, Elam will be destroyed as well. 26, Meshach and Tubal will be destroyed as well. And you keep going through. Edom there in verse 29, they'll all be destroyed. And so they'll all be slain in verse 31, and the entire destruction will happen. So, all right, pretty interesting stuff as we run through that and look at it, because you see the word for Leviathan, which shows up in the book of Job, here is a word for a crocodile. And so that's a little bit of trivia when you're working with Job's visions there at the end. Second thing, you see the idea about how Eden works in the way it does. Thirdly, most importantly, you see what the fate is of anyone who faces against God. Egypt built huge monuments that last even to today. The only thing the pyramids cannot overcome is that Pizza Hut, which is built right at the foot of the big one, right? Everything else, Egypt, those pyramids have been around before Moses. They've been there forever, it feels like. And yet, when Egypt faces against God, God wipes it out. They have no chance. Today, people stand against God. And it's like they have absolutely no memory. They forget what happened to the Egyptians. They forget what happened to the Assyrians. They forget what will eventually happen to the Babylonians. They forget what happened to the Romans. People today are like, I'm not going to believe in God. I want to be an atheist or an agnostic or whatever else it is. God always wins. And that's the lesson you see here. God always wins. Now, real quickly, let's just look at these three lessons. Number one, man-made kingdoms will never stand against God. And of course, Daniel 2 is my favorite place to go to for that, right? You've got Babylon, you've got Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, looking at that statue. Daniel 2:44, in the days of Rome, there shall be a stone not made with hands, and it shall grow and it shall destroy every kingdom which stands before it. No kingdom greater than God. You can be a citizen of whatever earthly kingdom you want to be, but you'd better make sure you're a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. That's the one that lasts. That's the one that does well. All right. Number two, politics. Are you going to go for Babylon? Are you going to vote for Nebuchadnezzar? Are you going to vote for Egypt and Hophra? Who are you going to vote for? Who are you going to trust? Don't get caught up in politics. Vote. God wants you to vote, and he wants you to bring your faith into the voting booth with you. We need to be the salt and light of this world, but realize that God's in charge. And sometimes God uses weird people for his purpose. People we wouldn't think he was using, God actually uses them for his purpose. Also, as you look over, not over just these 7 oracles, but the 7 overall, not just the 7 against Egypt, but the 7 overall, God is not just the God of Israel. I wanted to bring up over in Joshua, where there was a general who fought against Israel, and as he was fighting against Israel, he lost. And he was like, how could I lose? I got chariots. And he said, I know. God is a God of the plain. Yahweh is a God of the plain. And so he lured Israel up into the mountains because their God of the plains, he's going to stay down there. And so now he could use his chariots and wipe them out. And he went and fought, and he lost even worse. And God says, I am the God of the mountains. I am the God of the plain. I am the God of the entire earth. The lesson there, God is not just over his church. God is not just the God of Israel. God is a God of the entire earth. God is a God of the U.S. God is a God of Ukraine, of Russia, of China, of Japan. And we could list off it used to be 186 countries. I think it's 222 now. He's the God of every one of those countries. God is a God not only of my church, but of my finances, of my family, of my work and school, my recreation. God is over all things. And don't think that you can call up an Egypt or a Babylon or whatever else and leave God out of this part because we're going to work with that. God is in charge of everything.